Hello, my name is Dustin Zick, and I am the social media manager here at Discover Magazine. Welcome to our exciting live stream we're calling Cicada Mania, Uncover the Secrets of Cicadas, with PJ Liesch, an entomologist from UW Wisconsin. PJ, let's just kick it off. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, your work, and why you got into the field of entomology?
Sure. So I'm an extension entomologist here at UW-Madison. So I currently live and work in the Madison area in Wisconsin. I am a Wisconsin native. I grew up in a southeastern part of the state in a rural area, shared a yard with a dairy farm next door, as a lot of Wisconsinites do. But as a kid, I spent a lot of time outdoors catching frogs, salamanders, insects of various kinds. Also across the street happened to be an exotic animal farm. So I'd open up my window shades every day and see camels or hear lions roaring. And so with that said, it's perfectly natural to understand how I was always interested in biology. I knew when I started college from day one, I was going to be a biology major. I had no thoughts of changing that. And as I was in college, this insect called the emerald ash borer was starting to get attention in the news. And I tell folks that was my gateway bug. It really got my foot in the door. I did 2 summers of a research project looking for that insect here in Wisconsin and surveying ash trees for it. That led to coming to Madison in 2007 for graduate school. And I've been around ever since doing entomology.
That's great. I remember around the same time hearing about the emerald ash borer. I did not take the same path as you to go down into the bug stuff, but yeah, that was definitely a big deal, and I imagine to some extent still is a big deal around here. So let's talk about the topic at hand here, cicadas. Can you start by explaining what distinguishes periodical cicadas from other types of cicadas, including their unique lifestyle and why their emergence, in particular this year, is considered such a fascinating natural event?
Sure. So I guess just to set the stage and briefly define what a cicada is. So cicadas belong to a group called the order Hemiptera. These are insects that for the most part have sucking mouth parts. So stink bugs and aphids are in this group. There's a particular family, the family Cicadidae, which are the cicadas. And here in North America, we've got about 170 or so species. Worldwide, there's over 3,000. But there's many different types of cicadas. Now, what's really cool this year is we're talking about periodical cicadas. And the eastern part of the US is the only spot on the entire planet where these particular insects occur. Now, they're going to look similar to some of our other run-of-the-mill cicadas. So I've got next to me what we call a dog day cicada. These come out during the hot dog days of summer, and in many parts of the US we'll see these. But above it is a periodical cicada. So that's what we're going to be seeing in some parts of the country this year. They're a little bit smaller. Their coloration is different. They have black bodies, orange on the legs, orange on the wings, and a little hard to see this one. But when you see them up close, their eyes are a very distinctive, brilliant red color. So in terms of their appearance, they look different. These cicada species also have different songs or noises that they produce. You can tell them apart that way. But what really sets apart the periodical cicadas are their long, extended life cycles and their emergence patterns. Now, it depends on the group and the species involved. Some will emerge at 13-year intervals. That's what we're seeing currently in southern parts of the US. Others, like in the upper portions of the Midwest where I'm located, those have 17-year intervals. And it's a little mind-boggling just to think of an insect living for 17 years, but then to come out in these massive numbers. Our other cicadas, you see one here, you see one there, but these periodical cicadas can come out by the millions or billions sometimes in relatively small areas, which makes them truly unique.
Okay. So I know with the emergence this year, and what makes it particularly significant is there are 2 broods emerging. So I believe it's brood 19 and 13. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
Okay. Can you kind of talk about the key differences between those 2 broods in terms of behavior, their geographic distribution, and even their duration of their emergence when it starts and ends?
Sure. Yes, you're right. This year is unique for these periodical cicadas because we have not one, but two broods emerging in the same year. Brood 19, which are 13-year periodical cicadas, and Brood 13, which are 17-year periodical cicadas. The last time these two broods emerged at the same time would be 17 times 13. You go all the way back to the year 1803, and it's going to be another 221 years before they pop out in the same year again. So this is a thing in the US this year. Now, behaviorally and in terms of their appearance, these cicadas are all going to look fairly similar and have somewhat similar biology, other than the Brood 19. Those pop out on 13-year intervals. The Brood 13 and more northern areas pop out at 17-year intervals. But they're core aspects of their life cycle are very similar. They spend most of their time below ground, feeding on the roots of trees as juveniles. And after either 13 or 17 years, they emerge, they transform to adults. Now, when you talk about the broods or groups of periodical cicadas, the groups that have 17-year life cycles, they tend to have a more northern distribution. So across the US, from places like Iowa all the way over to Pennsylvania and some up into New England area as well. The three broods that happen to go through 13-year life cycles, they have a more southern distribution. And because temperature can be a factor with those, they emerge a little bit earlier in the year. So the southern US is currently seeing a lot of cicada activity in some spots, but for Brood 13, the 17-year cicadas, in many areas like northern Illinois and Wisconsin, they're going to be emerging in the next couple of weeks.
So do we know where the term brood came from and how many different broods are there? I'm going to guess there's at least 19. And how do we know which ones are which?
Yeah, so the term brood itself, you could also, I suppose, use the term cohort. And there's a couple different definitions for brood. If you raise livestock or chickens or something like that, you might say you have a brood of chicks. That can refer to a group of young. But another use of the word brood, it's a group having essentially a common origin or story or common nature. And so that's what we mean by the term brood. So it's been used in reference to cicadas going back well into the 1800s, just to refer to these groups of cicadas emerging at the same point in time. And that has allowed scientists to better keep track of these insects, because there's all these different broods emerging over the course of different years. And if we number them, it allowed folks to keep better track of that. So this naming convention has been around for a long time. There actually aren't quite 19 broods.
Okay.
There's a total of 15. But to help make this make sense, what the current convention said, the gentleman who developed it, this was in the late 1800s, and he said, okay, the current system that exists at the time was pretty chaotic. 1893, we're going to call that Brood 1. 1894, that's going to be Brood 2, and so on. And so you count upwards. So broods, Roman numerals 1 through 17, were reserved for groups with 17-year life cycles, and then you'd count up higher Roman numerals for broods with 13-year life cycles. But total, there's 15 broods. There's 12 with 17-year life cycles and 3 with 13-year life cycles.
Interesting. So what happened? Do we know why, and this isn't one of our pre-planned questions, but I'm curious, do we know why they've settled on 13 or 17 years versus 15, 5, any other amount? They seem oddly specific.
Yeah, and that's a great question. And that is one thing we still don't fully understand about these insects, which, makes you scratch your head a little bit for how abundant they can be coming out in the millions or billions of trillions. There's still key aspects of their biology we don't fully understand why. Now, there have been some discussions about this and speculations. One thought that, does have some merit is that it may be some sort of evolutionary strategy. If you are an insect that emerges in really large numbers, whatever feeds on you is going to catch on to that. And so if you emerge by the millions or billions every single year, the birds and fish and mammals that feed on you, they're going to catch on, and their populations are probably going to do well and increase, and that may harm you in the long run. But if you emerge at these relatively long time intervals, the vertebrates that are feeding on you, they generally don't live that long. They can't catch on to the cycle. And so you emerge at these long time intervals in such huge numbers that even though plenty of cicadas are being eaten, there's more to mate and reproduce and perpetuate the species. And so that might be part of it. It might be part of an evolutionary strategy and a survival strategy, perhaps. But to be honest, we still don't fully understand why the 13 or why the 17 years, because all the other cicadas, they have much shorter life cycles. It might be 2, 3, 4 years, something along those lines.
Interesting. So what happens during those 13 or 17 years that they're sitting underground? Are they, I know you mentioned that they feed on roots and things like that, but are they largely like kind of hibernating, or are they thriving and living? Disconnected? Oh, here we are. We're back, switching our heads around. Did you hear my question there?
I did, yeah. So essentially, what are they up to for all that time underground? Well, they're not just sitting there watching Netflix. It turns out they are actively feeding and growing. That's the main job of the juveniles, or nymphs, as we technically call them. So they are down in the soil, usually within about the top 2 feet or so, and they are associated with the roots of trees. So they use these needle or tube-like mouth parts, somewhat like a mosquito's, and they pierce the tree roots. They drink sap out of the trees. That's how they get their energy, from carbohydrates like that. And they are doing this over the course of either those 13 or 17 years.
Okay. Before I jump to the next question, just a reminder to anyone watching, we do have time at the end of this. If you have questions that we don't address, leave them in the comments. We'll try to get to them. And if we don't get to them during the actual stream, we can follow up afterwards as well. So as far as like the larger ecosystem in our food chain, how do large emergences of cicadas affect local ecosystems? You know, what role do they play in their environments? Who are their primary predators? Can we eat them? Who, you know, are humans considered a predator for them? Those kinds of things.
Yeah, so in terms of environmental impacts, the single biggest impact I can think of, and this is really a benefit as a whole, we have these massive numbers of these insects emerging, and as adults, they're relatively clumsy. They're also not very long-lived. The adults only live for about a month. So with that said, these insects are an abundant food source for wildlife. So if you are in a cicada hotspot where they occur, all sorts of wildlife will benefit. Birds in the area, as long as they're big enough to chow down on a cicada. If the trees that the insects are on are hanging over water and they fall into water, fish and turtles and other aquatic creatures might be feeding on these. On the land, terrestrial vertebrates like snakes, like perhaps tortoises in some areas, or terrestrial turtles that are up there on the ground might be eating them. But also a lot of mammalian vertebrates feeding on them, raccoons and skunks and so on. Even pets will feed on these. Some good news is they're not toxic. They're actually quite palatable. Humans can eat them too. They are not toxic again by any means. And if you dig back in the history books, some of our earliest records of periodical cicadas, or I should say written records, is when the Europeans came over, settled in places like Plymouth, and some of our records go back to about the 1630s. And it was written that Native Americans in those areas would collect and consume these. It's a readily available protein source. They don't come with a nutrition label on them, but insects can actually be relatively healthy in terms of protein and beneficial fats and some nutrients and minerals and things like that. I do know some spots in the US where folks are hosting events where they may be cooking up some of these insects. I know various restaurants may be doing this too as kind of a fun pop-up event. In the grand scheme of things, I know that some folks might seem a little bit squeamish by that idea, but I really suggest thinking about it from the perspective of you and I might go to a restaurant and pay a lot of money for lobster, crab legs, shrimp. Those are also arthropods. They're very closely related to insects. Some folks have even jokingly referred to cicadas as land shrimp or tree locusts or tree lobsters, things like that. So you can actually season them up, cook them up, and eat them. Some other environmental things, though, that come to mind. So not only are they a food source, but in urban areas around humans, they make all these tunnels up out of the ground that they're going to emerge through. And that's very similar to if you paid to have your lawn aerated. It creates these channels that might help a little bit with soil compaction, perhaps, but also allow water and nutrients to more readily infiltrate the soil, as well as oxygen getting down in there into the soil. So that can be an environmental benefit as well.
Okay. So what are some common misconceptions about cicadas? Also wondering, why does cicadas get louder when it's hot outside, and the impact of climate change as we're seeing it on their life cycle or their brood cycles?
Yeah, so there's a lot of misconceptions about cicadas. And I mentioned a moment ago that some of our earliest written records of these date back into about the 1630s or so. And it took European settlers a long time to really realize what was going on with these insects. And keep in mind the irregular intervals and extended intervals. With shorter lifespans back then, was this a once in a lifetime thing, or how would you know if it would occur again in another 17 years? So there's a lot of early myths and misconceptions. In some of the earliest literature, they were actually referred to as flies instead of cicadas. At another point in time, they were commonly called locusts, and that can have some biblical connotations because of plagues of locusts devastating crops. And when you look in newspaper columns from, say, the 1800s, there was often some confusion there because farmers would blame crop damage that occurred from locusts, or locusts are really a type of grasshopper. Farmers were sometimes seeing crop damage from true locusts, blamed it on periodical cicadas, which they called 17-year locusts. So that's a little bit of an older term for them. So there were some misconceptions there with the naming, and it took a long time for that to get straightened out. One other really interesting misconception about these insects is on the adults, there's actually a little zigzag pattern, a dark zigzag pattern on the tips of their wings. It happens to be some of the wing venation is outlined a little bit, and depending on which way you see the insect, it looks like either an M or a W. And historically, sometimes folks thought that that W was an indicator of a pending war. It was this bad sign. It really wasn't. It just happens to be how the insects happen to look. But that was a common misconception about these. Now, in terms of the air conditions, we do know that temperature and the air conditions can influence the sound that these insects produce. It turns out that with the male cicadas, their abdomen, the end of their body, is pretty much hollow for the most part. The organs are shrunk and tucked away. Their main purpose is to find a female and mate with her. So the male's abdomen is this hollow air chamber, and then on the sides of the abdomen are these membranes called tymbals, and those are the structures that actually produce the sound. So think of it like the membrane on a snare drum. And if you were to take that membrane and tap it or vibrate it, it produces sound. So they've got these membranes on the side of their body connected to the air chamber, and temperature can play a role with that internal air chamber, and that can affect the sound. But also we know there might be some changes in the frequency with higher temperatures. And we can see that sort of thing with other insects as well. Just for an example, crickets, if it's cooler, they chirp less. If it is hotter, you can have a higher frequency. So those are some of the roles that air temperature can play. And then in terms of climate change, there's some really interesting questions here. And we don't fully understand what climate change is going to mean for periodical cicadas. One thing that is undoubtedly going to happen is if we have an extended warm period during the year, so essentially an earlier spring, later fall, that's probably going to cause, we could expect, an earlier emergence of these insects in a given spot. So if historically in a given spot, the cicadas came out around the 1st of May, well, with climate change, they might be at some point down the line popping out in mid-April. What will that mean for the cicadas in the long run? We don't quite know at this point, but it will probably shift their emergence a little bit earlier. We could also potentially see the role of climate change affecting extreme weather events. And there's been a little bit of this noted in the literature where you might have a situation where you have an early start to the spring. It warms up, the trees start putting out a batch of leaves. Below ground, those cicada juveniles are drinking the sap from the tree roots, and they can detect the changes in chemicals. That may be a way they count the number of seasons. Well, if you have an early start to spring, the tree leaves out, the tree chemistry changes, and then you get a freak cold snap. And that causes the tree to go through kind of a fall-like period. It might lose its leaves. That might change the chemistry within the tree. The cicadas might count another cycle again when it warms up. And so if we have more extreme weather events, there could be some complications like that. And that might confuse essentially the cicadas locally. Instead of counting 13 or 17 years, maybe they might start popping out at 11 or 12 year intervals or 15, 16 year intervals. We don't know how much that's going to occur, but that's another possibility as well related to climate change.
Do we know, is there a way to identify what brood a cicada is from beyond just the year they emerge in that cycle of their emergence? Is there like some sort of genetic marker that we can use to identify it's from this brood or that brood?
Yeah, so there would be some genetic things you could potentially look at to tell those apart. Otherwise, the main way we tell apart the different species, because I didn't mention this earlier, I don't think, but for the 17-year cicadas, there's actually 3 different species, but they'll all pop out in the same general area at the same time. For 13-year cicadas, there's 4 different species. So we're talking about 7 different species that can be out this year in the US as a whole. They are generally going to look very similar, but when you look in identification guides to tell the species apart, usually a key question is it a 13-year cicada or a 17-year one? So that kind of splits the 2 groups apart. Then there's some anatomical features to look at as well. But if you had all of these lined up to the naked eye, they're all going to look very, very similar in appearance. So there are some very subtle things you can look at under the microscope. Otherwise, knowing when and where the insects emerged is a really important factor to be able to tell them apart.
Okay. Okay. So I know you touched a little bit on this, but, you know, we know what they eat when they're below ground. They feed on roots of trees. Does their appetite change when they're above ground in terms of what they're consuming? And I believe it's a misconception, but I would love you to confirm, like, can they cause any sort of significant damage to people's property and their landscaping and things like that?
Yeah, so in terms of feeding, it's really interesting. For a long time, it was thought that periodical cicadas do essentially all their feeding below ground as juveniles, and the adults come out and they simply try to find a mate, and that's about it, because they're short-lived. There's been some more recent research that looked at the gut contents of adults, and they essentially found that they are probably feeding or at least ingesting a little bit of material, sap from trees, although it's quite possible the reason for that may be more of a liquid balance. They're worried about getting dehydrated, essentially, so they're drinking the tree sap to get some liquid there. But as a whole, they probably aren't feeding much as adults, and it's going to be mostly as juveniles. But in either life stage, they're still feeding on trees for the most part. Maybe some shrubs or another woody plant like grapevines is an example. So that's what they feed on. And then what was the second part of the question, Dustin? Is there risk of them causing damage to property, whether it's, you know, structures or landscaping and things like that? Oh, sure. So for structures, no concern whatsoever. These things will not hurt your home or your cars or anything like that. They can technically cause a little bit of damage to woody plants, so trees, shrubs, maybe grapevines, is an example of another woody plant. And the reason they cause damage is not through the feeding activity of the adults. And I should point out one other thing. So the juveniles feeding below ground, even though they drink tree sap for 17 years, doesn't seem to phase the plants whatsoever. They tolerate it just fine. So the juveniles really not a concern for plants. Above ground, the adults, their feeding is so minimal, doesn't seem to phase plants at all. But when the females mate and they go to lay eggs, they have a specialized structure called an ovipositor. This structure under magnification looks like a spear or the tip of a pocket knife. And so they take this and they go to trees or shrubs or woody plants, and they really like plant structures that are about the diameter of a pencil or so. So maybe about 1/4 of an inch or so. The female takes this spear-like structure and cuts slits into the plant. This would be very much like if I took a pocket knife and started cutting little notches into that twig. So she's going to cut a whole bunch of notches in each little slit. She's going to lay a batch of eggs, and she's going to lay perhaps a couple hundred eggs total in her short adult lifespan. But what can happen, those twigs can die. They might snap off. The leaves can turn brown. Now, for a large tree, maybe you've got a 20, 30, 50-foot tall tree in your yard, this sort of damage can be very conspicuous and noticeable, but we know it really doesn't seem to harm the trees whatsoever. They do fine in the long run. There's even been some notes in the literature that if this happens to fruit trees, like an apple tree, for example, it acts as almost a natural pruning process, and those trees might do better the following year. You might have greater fruit set. So they technically cause this little bit of harm to the plants. In most cases, it's tolerated just fine. There's one situation where I would maybe be worried, and that would be a case if I knew I lived in a cicada hotspot. Maybe I saw them during a previous emergence. I know they're coming out this year, and I have a recently planted tree. Maybe I planted it this spring or a year ago, and it's not very big. But when the cicadas cause damage, it might cause the outer 6 to 10 to 12 inches of those twigs to die. On a big tree, that's a drop in the bucket. For a small tree where the canopy might only be 2 feet across or 3 feet across, if you lose the outer foot of those twigs, that could be a big proportion of the overall canopy. So that's the one situation I would recommend perhaps doing something. We know from some research trials that pesticides actually don't work very well at all for protecting plants. So the best thing you can do is actually get some fine mesh netting, about mesh size of 1/4 inch or less. You put that over the canopy of the tree or plant, and then you tie it off or somehow secure it at the base of the plant. That acts as a physical barrier. And if the cicadas can't get to the plants, they can't damage the plants. And you only have to do this for about a month when the adult cicadas are active. So here in the upper Midwest, when they're out mostly in the month of June, we can have that on there and take it off in July when they're done. And we don't have to worry about that again for 17 more years.
Super interesting. I'm going to have to tell my wife about that because we planted a new cherry blossom tree about 1.5 years ago. So something we're going to want to consider for sure. Can you talk, I think one thing we haven't really touched on at all here is the cicada hatching process and why it's so critical for their life cycle. When can we expect the next large brood emergence after this year? I know visually, I think when I think of cicadas, I think as much of the insect itself as I do like their shell that they've emerged from or hatched from. So can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah. And again, this goes back to the periodical nature of these insects coming out at long time intervals of 13 or 17 years. In other years, most of us will see our dog day cicadas that come out every year. You might see one here, one there. They leave an old exoskeleton on a tree, that sort of thing. But these big, massive periodical emergences are truly unique. So that's really cool about their life cycle. But in terms of that emergence, it's really important for the success of the species. So not only are they emerging in large numbers, and that's probably a survival strategy to essentially satiate all the predators feeding on them. There's so many, all the predators essentially get a full tummy. There's lots more still to successfully mate and reproduce. If you came out in smaller numbers, you'd get picked off, and good luck perpetuating your species. So you have to come out in large numbers, but also the synchronous timing of that in a given area is critical. If some started coming out a couple weeks early, they're going to get picked off. Some come out a couple weeks or a couple months late, they're going to get picked off. So they have to come out at the same time. And that's one mystery I've heard discussed recently about these insects. We still don't fully understand, how do they know to all come out at basically the same time? It's not like they're text messaging each other underground. How do they communicate that? Or is there a signal that tells them? We know there are some signals, environmental cues, that help trigger emergence. One key thing is the soil temperature. So these insects, again, they're below ground, especially that final year. They're maybe in the upper 8 to 12 or so inches of soil. And we know the soil temperature has to get to a temperature of 64 degrees or more at a depth of 8 inches. So this year I've been watching soil temperature maps, and it correlates pretty well with cicada emergence. So temperature of the soil has to get warm enough. But then another thing that seems to help is once you get warm enough soil, you get a decent rain around that time, and that percolates down through all these escape tunnels they've made a couple weeks ahead of time. And that really seems to help trigger them to come out. But again, how exactly do they all know to come out the exact time? We still don't fully understand that.
Okay. When can we, I know this emergence or convergence, I should say, of the emergence of these broods is essentially a once in a lifetime experience for any of us humans. When can we expect like the next large brood emergence after this year, whether it's the intersection of these 13 and 17, these two specific broods, or other broods intersecting?
Oh, yes. Yes. A great question. So this year, remember, the 17-year brood that's coming out is brood 13. And earlier we talked about the numbering scheme for these broods starting in 1893. That was brood 1. The next year, 1894, brood 2, and so on. So this year is brood 13. Next big brood to come out is next year, actually, brood 14, which will occur in some parts of the eastern U.S., places like Kentucky and Indiana, all the way over to Pennsylvania. So that's going to be our next big brood. So depending on where you're located, you might be seeing cicadas this year. You might also see some next year, too.
Okay. Another question that just came to me is, I know, like, geographically speaking, that the two broods that are coming out this year are largely separate, but are there locations where, whether or not they're coming out at the same time, but like multiple broods might coexist underground simultaneously?
Oh, yes. And there are some states where that happens a lot. So where I'm located in Wisconsin, we only have one brood. So when it comes out every 17 years, it's a big deal for us. Some other states, so like Illinois, Ohio, Indiana, Pennsylvania, states like that have multiple broods that can emerge at various points in time. And so underground, you can have a mixture of all these different broods in potentially a same general area. That might be 2, 3, 4, or potentially more broods for some locations.
Okay. But last question before, I think we have two audience questions, but before we get to those, I'm kind of curious, during significant emergence like the one we're seeing this year, and in even less significant ones, is there any like kind of special research that individuals like you, entomologists like you, are doing? And adjacent to that, is there ways that the public can kind of contribute to understanding cicadas better through community science projects, things like that, as in a way to help make this experience more enriching for those of us going through it?
Yeah, so a lot of research can be done, but when you think about it, it's almost a mad dash, especially if you're in a location where they only emerge every 13 or every 17 years. Because if you miss that opportunity to study those insects, you've got to wait a long time before it comes up again. along those lines, there's actually a report, one of the early published documents about these periodical cicadas in the US. The individual suspected they may have this 17-year life cycle, but they wanted to be absolutely certain. So they waited another 17 years just to check. So imagine having a book or a manuscript just about done and you say, hold up, I'm going to wait 17 more years just to double check something before you publish it. So again, it's kind of a mad dash to study these things. There are studies that can be done on their behavior. There's another researcher out there studying a really cool fungal parasite that can infect and kill these, which we should probably chat about because it's like something out of science fiction. I think a lot of efforts, though, are simply trying to better understand when and where these insects emerge. There's maps that have been going around national news that roughly show where they occur, but in actuality, the distribution, it's more like pins on a map. So if an entire county is shaded in, but they only occur in one corner of the county, it doesn't tell you the full story. So there are some scientists out there that I know will be driving around simply looking for these things in a relatively short time span, about a month while they're out. To help with that, there are some community science projects as well. So perhaps the best known one out there for cicadas, it's called Cicada Safari, and it's a smartphone app. So you can download it, and this is a nationwide effort, and you can use your smartphone to observe, take a picture of a periodical cicada, and then upload it, and it'll automatically say when and where it was discovered. So that's one tool that's out there. There's also websites like iNaturalist, where you can upload your photos and your sightings to help better document these insects. Because I'm located here in Wisconsin, and I'm particularly interested in the distribution, the fine scale distribution of these insects in the state of Wisconsin, I've started my own community science project here on my periodical cicadas in Wisconsin website, where folks they don't have to download an app. They can just go to a form, answer a handful of questions, upload a couple photos, and that's going to help me better develop our map for the state of Wisconsin. So there's really a number of community science projects available online related to periodical cicadas.
Okay, awesome. Well, before we jump to those two audience questions, what can you share a little more about that fungal infection? Is it anything like the cordyceps fungus thing from the Last of Us TV series and things like that?
It is. It's very much like that. So this is what we would refer to as an entomopathogenic fungus or insect infecting fungus. So harmless to people, but this particular fungus, it's the genus Massospora, happens to infect these periodical cicadas. And we still don't know some of the key things about the cycle of how it goes about infecting or when. And so there's a lot of unknowns for that still. But this is a fungus out there in the environment that can infect periodical cicadas, and it does some really wild things. So once cicadas become infected, the fungus starts producing chemicals, which happen to be a type of amphetamine. So it's releasing these into the cicada's body. We know it alters the behavior of these insects. So these infected cicadas are high off of these drugs being produced in their body by the fungus, changes their behavior. We know when the cicadas are out, they're trying to mate for a month or so. That's all they're really trying to do. But this fungus and the chemicals it produces really whip that up into a frenzy. And in terms of their behavior, if a male cicada becomes infected with this particular fungus, it changes the behavior of it. So male cicadas are the ones that sing and make all the noise. The females don't sing back. What she can do, though, she'll snap her wings like that in a response if she's receptive to the male. And then they get closer and closer, a little back and forth before they go and go about their business. But male cicadas that are infected with this fungus, they switch from singing and they'll do some of the wing snapping too. So they're pretending to be a female to mate or attempt to, kind of pseudo mate with other males. And this is the fungus behind all this to get spread of the fungal spores. And while this is all going on, the fungus is literally eating away some of the internal organs and the anatomical reproductive structures of the male cicada. So these infected cicadas, they're high, their behavior is different. They're trying to mate with all the other cicadas they can bump into, and they're spreading these fungal spores around to potentially infect more cicadas. And I've even heard of them jokingly referred to as salt shakers of death. Because if you were to pick up one of these infected cicadas, they get this bulbous plug-like structure at the back end of their body. That's where the spores are. And if you were to shake one of these cicadas, some of these whitish spores can actually drop off of the thing. So it's just like The Last of Us. It's very wild and science-esque when you think about it.
So is the thought kind of that the fungus, driving the cicada is essentially trying to infect another one before it eats away at all of its food and the one that it's in, and essentially loses its ability to parasite that one, kind of.
Right. And if you think about it, if the pathogen killed the host too quickly, you're not going to get spread. So it doesn't kill it outright. It keeps it alive. But also remember, the abdomen of the males is essentially hollow. There's not a whole lot there. And so if the male cicadas lose that part of their body, they still can kind of stumble around zombie-like in appearance. So it's pretty wild when you think about it.
That's absolutely crazy. I love it. Okay, so the two audience questions that we had, one is from Melanie Wilson, and she is asking, do periodical cicadas appear anywhere else besides the eastern part of the U.S.? If not, do we know why that is?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. In terms of the periodical cicadas that we're talking about with these long 13 or 17-year life cycles, it's only the eastern part of the U.S. Now, these do range from parts of Wisconsin and Iowa down into the northeast corner of Texas, across to Georgia and the Carolinas, and then even up into New York, New England area. But that's the only place on the planet where they occur. A couple other spots worldwide, there are some cicadas that have a little bit longer life cycle, might be in the range of 4 years or something like that. But to have these really long life cycles, that's unique and only occurs in the eastern U.S. And in terms of why, that is a mystery to science. We really don't quite know how that is or why that is. There are some cool papers out, though, that talk about the evolution of these periodical cicada species, how that maybe came about. Maybe there's some effort on the insect to be able to try to avoid attack by the fungus we just discussed. So there's some really cool papers that dive into the evolution of these. But why eastern U.S., we really don't quite know. Part of it may be habitat. They need trees that are there for long periods of time. So compared to a desert, you just won't have cicadas like that there. But when you think about it, Europe has historically had plenty of trees and other parts of the planet too. So it's still a little bit of a mystery in terms of why they only occur in the eastern U.S.
Okay. And our last audience question actually comes from Alex Orlando, who's one of our editors for our print publication. He asked specifically, going back to the topic of eating cicadas as humans, are there any health risks to eating them, considering they're known to contain mercury residues?
Yeah, so there is a bit published out there about cicadas potentially picking up mercury from plants that they feed on. So that is something to keep in mind. I haven't dug terribly deep into that literature, but we do know it can vary from site to site. And so if you happen to know that your yard or your particular part of your state happens to have high mercury content in the soil, then that might be something important to consider versus, in the contrast, if you know that your soil has low mercury content, then that would be a different situation. So yes, there is some literature out there about them picking up mercury, but it varies site by site quite a lot. Another thing to point out about risks, potential risks of consuming cicadas as a food source. Cicadas, they are not only insects, but they belong to a larger group called the arthropods. These are invertebrates that have a hard exoskeleton and jointed legs. Well, shrimp, crabs, lobsters are also arthropods. They're related to one another. And so just as out of an abundance of caution, if you happen to have a shellfish allergy to shrimp or crab or lobster, you really should avoid eating the cicadas just in case there's any sort of cross reactivity there. So just wanted to mention that as a precaution.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Well, that's all the questions that we have right now. I want to thank you so much for this wealth of information that you've given us over the past 45 minutes. Before we log off here, is there anything you want to wrap up with, a message to the millions of Americans that are going to be experiencing this emergence if they're not already?
Sure. Yeah, the main take-home message I've really been communicating to folks is that this is truly a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, because we have, again, not one, but two broods of these insects coming out. And the last time they emerged together was back in 1803. It's going to be 221 years before they will both emerge again. So even our kids and grandkids will probably not see this sort of thing happening again. So this is truly unique. I also have been comparing it to that total solar eclipse we had a while back. I know folks that travel to different states, sometimes across the country, just to catch a glimpse of that rare natural phenomenon. And if you happen to live in a spot where these insects occur, and because of the long extended life cycles, 13 or 17 years, you might only have potentially a handful of opportunities in your entire life to see them. Personally, I turned 40 years old next year. I've never seen these before with my own eyes. I missed them in 07. I missed them in 1990, even though I've lived in Wisconsin my whole life. I'm really looking forward to seeing them this year. But when I count ahead, I might only have 3-4 opportunities in my entire life to see these in Wisconsin where I'm located. So that makes them a truly rare and special natural phenomenon. So I really look at it with that sense of wonder.
That's awesome. Well, thank you again so much, PJ, and thank you to everyone who joined us today. Have a great summer.